Hey writers, let's take a minute here and talk about the KidLit market. Since you are a writer, there is a good chance that you grew up reading books. But what I want to tell you is that the books that you loved as a kid or even as a teen, that market has changed a lot over the last few decades, and it continually changes. So I'm recording this video in June of 2026. If you're watching it much later, I would encourage you to find sources that are even more up to date because this is a market that is constantly changing. All right, let's start with our youngest readers. This is where the board book market comes in, and they're called board books because of that really thick pages that they have within them. The really thick pages, they're essentially like boards, okay, like the cardboard. And the reason why these books are the way that they are is because it's expected that toddlers will be chewing on these books, that they will be maybe rough with the pages themselves. You don't want them to tear like paper could easily do. And so these are very sturdy books. They also tend not to have very many pages because of their formatting. They're heavily illustrated, very low word count. Sometimes the board books have a story in them. Sometimes they're also more of a learning concept book, teaching kids their first words or things about their world. There's a whole slew of different types of board books. It is not very common for a debut author to make their debut in the board book market. Board books often come from intellectual property that's owned by the publishing house or in conjunction with another media entity. There are a few people, of course, that make original board books. It's just not common to become a debut author through this market. So that's something to be aware of. All right, now we're going to move into our picture book market. This is usually geared towards kids, say from ages 3 to 8. Some will say 3 to 7, but I like to push that maybe just a little bit higher. And quite frankly, all of you who are teachers and educators know that picture books are being read all throughout elementary school. So picture books are even read by audiences of kids with 10, 11 years old. So, you know, this age can span a bit broader. But a picture book is a story that is told with both words and pictures. And one thing to know with picture books is that the illustrations really are a huge component of the story. They are telling part of the story. So you should have a clearer understanding of the story because of the illustrations. The illustrations are a significant part of that, to the extent that if we took the illustrations away, the story wouldn't make sense to the reader. So that's how important the illustrations are. It's more than just an illustrated story, okay? So picture books often will have either a writer and an illustrator that contribute their creativity to make this book. It's also becoming more common for a picture book to be created by what's called an author illustrator, a person who is doing both the writing of the words and the making of the pictures. The picture book market has seen significant changes in the last couple of decades. Noticeably, the word count tends to be getting lower and lower and lower. It's not uncommon now for a target word count in a picture book to be 300, maybe 400 words. It's not as common to find picture books that are 1,000 words, unless you are maybe writing in the nonfiction market, and then you might have a longer word count depending on the audience intended for that book. But if you are writing fiction picture books, it's important for you to know that your words are going to be very important in terms of like how you select and how you write. You need to write tight, quick pacing. And the other thing that the picture book is really amazing at, it's different than all the other formats. We have this issue of a page turn, and it's an incredible feature of this format. It is the key mark feature, perhaps, of the picture book format, and you should use those page turns to your advantage. You can use them as a way to create pacing and tension and all sorts of wonderful things within the story itself. So this is something that we don't often worry about. Like in novels, an author doesn't worry about where the author is going to turn the page necessarily, but in a picture book, it's something that should definitely be in consideration. So again, you're looking for that elementary school age child, figure about ages 3 to 7, 3 to 8, and you're aiming for about 3 to 400 words. The vocabulary in picture books is very interesting because it's often assumed that an adult, whether it's a teacher or a parent or grandparent, it's assumed that adult is going to be reading that with the child or to the child. So it tends to be all right to have slightly more enriched vocabulary or complex style of writing. So it's not to be confused with an early reader, which we're going to talk about next. So an early reader is exactly what it sounds like. It is a book that is intended to help young children master the skill of reading. So there's a lot of repetition within early readers, simple vocabulary, simple sentence structure. The early reader categories of books can go from the simplest of, a child just learning their first words, all the way up to perhaps a mid-elementary age student who is becoming more fluent and still looking for practice with their reading. So it covers a wide range of reading levels, but the focus of the early reader is to help the child master the skill of reading. It is not very common for authors to break into the market through an early reader. Usually those are works for hire created by publishing houses, or sometimes successful authors might be approached to create an early reader series. It's not very common for someone to break into the market through early readers. And so for the early readers, we're looking for anything, usually the target age is going to be for children ages, say, 5 to 9, that early elementary age. And again, that's because they're learning how to read. So simple sentences, simple vocabulary, depending on what reading level you would be looking at, would also impact the word count. They will have illustrations in them, but unlike picture books, the illustrations are there to support the text rather than to augment the text in a way that's telling a fresh story. The illustrations really are usually there to support what the reader is learning as they are mastering the skill of reading. And then we have chapter books. Chapter books are also kind of like the next progression within the reading stage. So you've got your elementary age kids, usually ages 6 to 9. These are the kids that can manage longer stories. They might read for longer stretches of time. They've learned how to decode words, and so they're ready to take on this idea of putting together more of a narrative while they are reading. So chapter book word counts can also vary widely depending on if I'm talking about an early chapter book or a later chapter book, but you're usually looking in single digit thousands of words, maybe up to like 15,000 words, maybe 20 if it's really pushing an older audience. But it's still going to be a shorter word count than what we typically see in our middle grade novels. The chapter book market can also be a difficult market for debut authors to break into. It's often, again, based on intellectual property or successful series that have already been developed. The thing with the chapter books is they almost always come in a series of several books because this helps a developing reader to be able to encounter a story and work on their skills while they are reading a world and a character that's already familiar to them. So it's really common to find chapter book series of 6 or more books within a series that can just help to nurture the reader as they are developing higher level skills. All right, so now we're going into the middle grade market, and this is kind of like a bread and butter market, if you will, of children's literature. And I do want to be careful to point out that chapter books, which we just talked about, are different from middle grade as far as a market conversation is concerned. People who are not familiar with publishing conventions might sometimes confuse those terms because they'll see a novel that's written for children and think, this child is old enough to read a book with chapters, they're reading a chapter book. But in the publishing world, chapter book for children is a very specific thing, and it's different from middle grade novel, and the middle grade novel is what most people are actually more familiar with when it comes to children's literature. So middle grade is going to have a wide variety of word count and ages. It's going to cover typically ages 8 to 12. But if you've known any 8-year-olds and 12-year-olds in your life, you know that these two ages are very different. A lot of maturity and development and all sorts of things happens between the ages of 8 and 12. And so it's really a very wide kind of spectrum of an audience, even though we're only looking at a range of 4 years. So sometimes you might hear people talk about a lower middle grade. This is a book that is targeted towards an audience typically ages 8 to 10. And then you'll hear an upper middle grade, and this will typically push 10 and up, sometimes even 12 to 14, depending on the context of the book that you're talking about. So word counts are trending lower than they used to be. I'm personally a fan of this because I felt that middle grade was getting very bloated in its word count. And so I'm happy to see this word count coming back down. But the word count is going to typically range about 35 to 40,000 words for your average middle grade, especially if you're talking like contemporary fiction. If you're writing historical fiction or fantasy, something that requires a lot more world building, then you will probably have a slightly longer word count, maybe even pushing that 60,000 word count. If you are in the lower middle grade, and if you are typically, if you are trying to reach an 8 to 10-year-old reader, then you're probably looking at a slightly lower word count, maybe more like that 30,000 word mark. And if you're going towards an upper middle grade, then you might be able to push it more into that 50,000 word. It's important to note, though, at least at the time of this recording, publishing word counts are trending low for some pragmatic reasons, in that paper is expensive. And so some of that is impacting how we write the stories and how long the stories can be. But also there's some concern in the KidLit market right now about children and their attention spans, which is another reason why word counts may be coming down a bit. So if you are writing upper middle grade, then we start to move maybe into this blurry line of upper middle grade to lower YA. And upper middle grade would typically cover ages 12 to 14, maybe 10 to 14, depending on the content within the book, whereas lower YA would typically go very similar, say like ages 12 to 15. Right now there's a push, at least with what people are saying. We'll see if the market responds to grow these markets. It kind of feels like these upper middle grade, like these 7th and 8th graders and 9th graders, kind of get left behind in the publishing market. There aren't a lot of books targeted towards this age group, and some of the YA stuff gets too dark or too heavy too quickly for some of these younger kids, and yet they want to move on from what they feel is babyish when they're looking at the younger middle grade books. So we'll see if the market responds to that, but right now people say that they would like to see more upper middle grade and lower YA, so we'll see about that. If you are writing YA, that's typically for a teen audience, and the word count will be a bit higher than middle grade, but not quite as high as an adult market. So if you're writing a contemporary YA, I would say you're probably shooting for 70, 75,000 words. And again, if you're writing one of those genres that requires more world building, then you will probably be pushing more like 90, maybe 100,000. But I think that's kind of a hard ask right now with word counts being as they are. Again, I mentioned the lower YA. You can also have this upper YA, which is specifically focused more on readers in the 16 and older category. It's worth pointing out that a lot of adults now read YA, and there's even been some complaints about whether they should be. I believe that a book can be read by people of all ages. There's nothing wrong with that. However, if you're truly writing YA for teen readers, then I would encourage you not to worry too much about that adult audience. If that adult audience wants to find and love your book, that's great. But since we're focusing on the kidlit side of things, it would be great if we had more books that were actually written for teens and not the adults who are trying to maybe creep in on that space a little bit. I happen to love reading YA too, but I don't expect it to be written for me as a middle-aged woman. So I hope that this span here of the KidLit categories helps to give you an idea of word counts and age categories and what these different terms mean. I also want to point out that as we talk about these age categories, it's worth noting that they are not genres. So within these age categories and these markets that I've mentioned, you still have genres. So for instance, you can have middle grade mystery, middle grade historical fiction, middle grade sci-fi. And in YA, I can have YA contemporary fiction, YA fantasy, YA thriller. We can find all these genres within the age category itself, but we don't want to refer to middle grade or YA as a genre. That's not what we want to do here. So just keep that in mind. And like I said, please try to find resources and stay up to date with the current trends. Sometimes if you are looking to query, it's time for you to see if your work will be accepted anywhere and you're querying agents or editors. Sometimes having a word count that's way out of the expectation for the market is enough to get a pass without an agent even looking at your manuscript. So it's important that you know what's going on in the market now. And so keep in mind that this is, again, in June of 2026 as I am recording this. So it's constantly in flux, and who knows what the future will bring. But writing for kids and teens is a wonderful and noble endeavor. And I wish you the best if you are choosing to embark on this journey with your writing.